All right. So, welcome everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. I'm delighted to be with all of you today for a special audio-only version of our regular programming. I'm joined by author Carolyn Hays for a discussion of her book, A Girlhood, Letter to My Transgender Daughter. And welcome, Carolyn. We're delighted to have you with us. And Carolyn is a pseudonym, and it's important that we honor the reasons why it's a pseudonym. So you've written other books, and it's important that we talk about the need for a pseudonym in this time. So could you just begin by telling us a little bit about how this book came to be and why you're choosing to write it in this way?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. So I think that, the pseudonym, for anybody who's kind of been in the trans world or paying attention to the news right now, might be pretty obvious. I've written many books, I've published many books, and this book definitely was one that couldn't come out under my own name because I wanted to protect my daughter, her identity, but also protect my whole family. We have 3 older kids as well. And so, in the book, I talk about, what happened to us, an incident, a backlash incident that happened to us. And, I wanted to be able to do that as honestly, the whole book as honestly as I possibly could, while telling an intimate story too, because I directly addressed my daughter throughout it as a letter to her. So I think of the audience as kind of being able to listen in, on me handing this story over to her.
It's such a beautiful book, and I really do feel honored to get to talk to you and honored to get to read something that does feel so generous, such a generous thing to share, right? And I think the pseudonym enables that, and it's really clear. And so I'm glad that you were able to figure out a way to do that kept your family, or I hope will keep your family safe, and also allowed you to tell your family's truth. Because I think in addition to it being just a beautiful story about, a mother and a daughter, and specifically a mother and a trans daughter, it's also just a really beautiful portrait of your family and the various communities that you've moved through as a family. And I think parents of all children right now are really hungering for realistic stories of family. So can you tell me a little bit about how did you write the book in the order that it appears, or did you sort of piece it together in different ways? I was curious about whether you pieced it together from memory, from journal entries, or if you set out after the fact and really put together a book proposal and wrote it in that way.
Well, I took notes, because for 10 years I really couldn't write about the book. I couldn't process really, or I was in the process of processing what had happened, and I was still in the thick of raising kids. And it was strange to be writing books, novels, when I was living something that felt so much more kind of beautiful and raw and upending than anything actually writing in fiction. I took a lot of notes. And then I just kind of, once I also had to wait for my daughter to be old enough where I felt like she could participate in that decision, to publish the book. Even under a pen name, I still wanted to make sure that she felt good about it. And, the politics had changed in such a way that I was hoping that this story would become, unimportant because we've moved on. And unfortunately, there's a real contraction of really the American heart in some way. And it really has been hardened, and we've seen legislation and all kinds of stuff that really attacking trans families, trans kids, trans adults. So that's been a problem. But I think that so it became more urgent. Didn't just become a problem. The story became more urgent.
Yeah.
And I really kind of beat my head against a wall until I figured out that it was direct address, until I figured out it was a letter to her, to give her the story that she lived, and to hand it back to her. And so and kind of like Ta-Nehisi Coates's Between the World and Me, that was a really, incredible book for me to read, and it gave me this space to really investigate. Like he's also working in a literary tradition there, but gave me a space to say, okay, well, if I do it this way, it's beautiful in a number of ways that gives that intimacy, but also it's you. I get to use the pronoun you, which doesn't have a gender, or it's any gender that the recipient wants to. It allows the recipient of that pronoun to choose the way it's accepted. So the you really swung the doors wide open for me, and then sometimes what I hope is that when somebody's reading it, whether that's a trans adult or someone else who just needs to hear. And hopefully the love and compassion that's in the book can just apply it to themselves, and just accept that part of it. So,
and that does seem to be, certainly as a trans adult myself, I think that, so many, I have a really great relationship with my parents and especially with my mother. And I do have that, an affirming. I have a parent who saw me as a child, even though I did not come out as trans until I was much older because I didn't have that language. But I think this will be very healing for a lot of trans people to read, and read particularly that direct address, which, I think people, when they read memoirs, especially people who are more casual readers, they may not think very much about the craft of memoirs. I think I'm asking about, whether you kept a journal, not because I think you could just publish your journal, because obviously memoirs take an immense amount of craft. I think people often don't realize that in some ways they can take even more craft than fiction in moments, right? Because it's figuring out what is the correct way to balance all of these really difficult concerns and questions, and to honor all of the people who are alive, and that you love very much, and balance the research. That you did a lot of research in this book. It's a really wide-ranging book, and there's a lot of beautiful questions of theology in the book. I was raised Catholic as well, and so I really appreciated you wrestling with the questions of our innate divinity as human beings, that we are all children of God. And I think one of the things Charis, our store, that word means gift or grace in Greek, and Charis was originally founded as a Christian bookstore, and people are always shocked by that because they're like, you godless, queer and trans heathens, like y'all are the ones who, have one of the oldest Christian bookstores in the South. But it's because our version of what Christianity can mean is so much more expansive, right, than what it has come to mean in our culture. So I love how wide-ranging the book is, and how many different threads you pull in addition to honoring the daughter that is the focus of the book and the object of direct address, but also your other children. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you decided to pull in the other. Did you always know that you were going to tell the story of your family kind of as an organism or as a herd, or did that evolve over time?
I definitely added more as I had friends read the book and say, yeah, I want to know more. I want to know more about how this was affecting the older kids. And I think that, I should probably back up and talk about the beginning of the book a little bit to set it up, because then people, the kids. So, our daughter was fairly young. She was assigned male at birth, but was quick to tell us as soon as she could speak, that, she was a girl, that God had gotten it wrong, that, and she was persistent, consistent, and acute, as they say in kind of research terms, about her identity. And so eventually, we did research, we talked to experts, and we really decided that, there was that moment where she said, when you say that I am beautiful, say she is beautiful. And so that was for me a really, a spiritual moment, honestly, because when somebody talks about their own beauty, everyone deserves to be seen as beautiful in the way they see themselves, or it's not true. It's not real. You're not seeing the person in front of you, right? There's an erasure that kind of comes with mis-seeing someone. So when she said that, I really felt that she was talking about kind of the divinity of her soul, like the deepest part of herself. And so that was a real turning point for me. So we did, just allow her to use, we changed to female pronouns. She put a barrette in her hair. She got to choose her clothes, and we used a nickname. Shortly thereafter, there was a knock at the door. And so that knock was, there had been an anonymous call, and, the Department of Children and Families, there was an investigator sent. And so we were being investigated for child abuse because we were supporting our trans daughter. As kind of wild and upending and terrifying as that moment was, that now has become state law in Texas, and the governor of Texas this past spring signed that into law. It's now being challenged. But what really felt, just horrific and terrifying to us, we could not have fathomed that it would become law, in a million years. So this is why this book has become even more urgent. So in any case, that family that you're talking about, because the older kids are a good bit older. My eldest daughter was 12 when the baby was born, and then there were 2 boys. And so, it's interesting to see them, kind of grapple with gender, just kind of curiosity of seeing them figure that out, how quick they were to support her. And certainly when someone came at us in this way, and we quickly learned that if this escalated and we went before a judge, could very well in the Deep South be a Republican appointed judge, and that in the end we could lose custody. So when that happens to a family, it doesn't just happen to the parents, it happens to the children, the other children, it happens to the grandparents, it happens to all the cousins. We both big, we're Catholic family, it happened to so many people. That trauma just kind of rippled out into our community. And I think what surprised me most about the book, in writing it, going back to revisit it, I was very scared to go back and revisit because I was afraid of the trauma, and kind of being back in that space. But what the kind of the overwhelmingly surprising part about it was I had to go back through all of the letters of support and to go back all my notes of all the love and all the people who, really stood by us at that time. And that was so emotional. I wasn't crying during the parts about the trauma. I was crying, kind of with gratitude at the parts of all of the love that came out. But it affects not just the kid and the parents, it also the family, the relatives, and the community. It really, really tears at a community.
I think it's so beautiful, the way that you express the people, the joy and the gifts of presence of people who showed up for you and your family and your daughter at that time and throughout her childhood, but particularly at that really scary time. And then the flip side of that, what was taken from you as an individual, as a mother, and then as a family, of being able to trust your neighbors because you didn't know who filed that report.
Right.
And can you talk a little bit, for folks who, I know we have so many parents in our community who are very afraid that a similar law, they're terrified in solidarity with people in Texas, and they are very terrified that a similar law will get passed in Georgia. And that's not an unreasonable fear, right? Or that, the Roe v. Wade overturning is going to, or for lack of a better word, overturning is going to mean the end of bodily autonomy for trans people as well. Like the justification for privacy for all people has gone away, basically. And so I think it's important for us to know and really think about the repercussions of what that means. And I think the way you describe your fear in that moment is really important. So could you talk a little bit about kind of what was lost for you, even though your child was not lost, thank God?
Yeah, it was really a breach. I thought I had a pact with my country, some things were inviolable, and inviolatable. The word I'm talking about. Inviolate, I think, is the word. But that they couldn't be breached, and then when that went away, it was horrific, and I was paranoid about the neighbors, as you said. I didn't have the opportunity to address them and to educate and to show compassion for them and to meet them wherever they were, which is something that I would have loved to have had that opportunity. So yeah, the problem here for parents is that fear, when you live in fear that something terrible is going to happen to your kids, if this and if that, if they go out into the world looking like this, or if they go out in the world acting like this, is that you start to shut them down. And it's actually all from love, right? Yeah. You love them so much, but you have this fear, so you're going to shut them down. And then that fear in a kid's head so quickly turns to shame. Yeah. It can't distinguish between, oh, my mother's afraid and therefore, it's more like, oh, my mother's ashamed and therefore, and so it gets internalized where it falls in their body. You can't regulate that. You can't explain that necessarily to a kid. It's so fast and so subconscious. So what, churches and governments have done over the years is get in the way of a parent's kind of natural bond with their child, with these, ideas of who should be loved and who shouldn't, who should be accepted and who shouldn't. And you should never let a government or a church or anything get in the way of your love for your child. If you can't express your love for your child and celebrate this child in front of you because of, this or that or the other, that's the problem. The government, the church, whatever that entity is, that's the problem, because they're getting in the way of something that's incredibly natural. And I've talked to the parents, who have rejected their children, and their hearts beat so hard and they long so much for the love of that child. They punish themselves so much. So it's painful in all ways. And so there's a great Nick Krieger is a writer. He's a trans man. And he has a book called Neither Here Nor There, about, his transition. But I kept this quote above my desk, when this was first going on and when I came across this quote. But it's this is what I say to parents. This is the way Nick wanted to be raised. I wish someone had told me not that my life would be hard, but that it would be phenomenally rich. I wish someone had told me that through my own self-inquiry and my unique experience, my empathy would deepen, my compassion would expand, my gratitude for being alive would be huge. And because I just kept that, that's what I want to infuse in my daughter. You know what I mean? Yes, yeah. Your life is going to be rich. This journey is incredible. But also, with the parents, you're along for that ride. Guess what's going to happen to you? Your empathy is going to deepen. Your compassion is going to expand. Your gratitude for being alive is going to be huge. And so, there's so much beauty in this journey. And it is incredibly, frustrating to see that we were making such progress for trans kids and families and trans adults, and then to see this backlash kind of ginned up, he's stoking these flames, by certain legislators and Republicans in office. Is just them trying to find someone to blame, trying to find someone to villainize, to dehumanize, to make a boogeyman out of, so they come across as some savior. And it's just really, really cruel. And that they're targeting people with misinformation is incredibly cruel, but also that they're getting between the natural bond of love between a parent and a child is, to me, really reprehensible.
Yeah, it's, there's so much to unpack in what you just said. And we got to host Nick for Neither Here Nor There when that book came out, and he's such a lovely person. So I was excited to see that quote in your book. That's a beautiful book. That thing of like, so many parents go through the phase of, I am terrified for my child and I don't know how to express it. And so the child assimilates that fear into their sense of self and feels that they are wrong because the world is wrong. And it's like the hardest articulation, no matter how old the child is, it's like they can be 25, they're not a child anymore, but expressing, I remember when I came out to my parents as an adult, they very well-meaningly said, I just wish your life wasn't going to be so hard. I'm just afraid for your safety, which is a well-meaning thing to say, but it has the effect of putting the burden on me, to feel like a problem. And one of the things that we talk a lot about in our Gender Creative Parenting Collective is that parents of many different marginalized or minoritized identities have to, and frankly, parents of girls in general, have talks about safety in different ways that are more or less effective and more or less shaming, right? But, the way that we talk to girls about navigating the world in a misogynistic and patriarchal society, particularly around sexual assault and violence, can go many different ways, right? Like, occasionally it's affirming. Most of the time it's really shaming, right? Most of the time it's like, don't get assaulted by leading someone on. Even now, I mean, there are very few feminist scripts, and we since Trayvon Martin's murder and the Black Lives Matter movement, there have been more conversations about the education that Black parents give their children about the police and about safety, so that they are not murdered, right? And different populations, immigrant children being afraid for their parents and what they are allowed to disclose and what they have to keep private. All of these threads are woven through American society of the burdens we place on children to keep themselves safe, when the unsafety is our culture, right? But the children internalize it. And so we spend a lot of time trying to think about, and I think your book does a really good job of trying to think about, how do you tell the truth in age-appropriate ways to your daughter that the world is not always kind, but she gets to be who she is. And like, she gets to tell her truth to the people that she wants to tell her truth to, and you will try to set up appropriate expectations for what that truth might mean to people, but you also are going to give her the opportunity to risk unsafety sometimes, even if, like, by that I mean like in difficult conversations and things like that. It seems like that, walking that line of, I'm going to trust you to know, and it seems like you did that really beautifully with your daughter, in terms of you are going to tell your first grade or kindergarten best friend your truth, and we're going to talk about the difference between privacy and a secret, and then that's going to evolve. So could you talk a little bit about sort of how that has evolved, how y'all's thinking about that has evolved, because it seems like it shifts a little bit throughout the book, and as your daughter gets older, you support her in different ways around how she thinks about her own relationship to her privacy and her safety.
Yes. Well, going back to, to civil rights, as you're talking there, I think that, it's not new to threaten and to take children away from their parents. This goes back to Native cultures, it goes back to slavery, all the way up until, the Trump administration made it policy at the border, to separate children and their parents. So it is something that's been a tactic for a really long time, with a very ugly history in America. So, it's an old playbook, right? And so, in terms of my daughter, I do think of like, you have to make this call about who you tell and who you do not tell. And safety kind of rules the day in a lot of those situations.
Yeah.
Because you have to decide, and sometimes sometimes obviously it's not telling people that she's trans, but sometimes you got to get out in front of it. Something's coming, and you've got to be able to tell that story and get in front of that story and rally your troops. And having some people who know and who you trust, and who will have your back. So it has changed over time. And, and my daughter's, it's hard enough right now just, doing math. Geometry's hard.
Yes.
To have, and not to mention being in high school, it's hard for everyone. And so the extra burden of all of this is certainly a lot for her to take on. So I often see in trans people that, this ability to read a room better, it's just a skill that they just are so much, they practice so much more. And I just remember as a kindergartner, I said to her, well, what would happen if you wanted to tell your class or what have you? And she said, well, it would be okay except for these 5 kids. And she named them, and she nailed exactly how they would react and how it would be negative.
Mm-hmm.
This one would be silly. These 2 would be mean. And she was completely spot on,
Yeah.
So, yes. So I also, for all of our kids, when I was saying to my husband, when it really broke down with all that fear, really, really broke down, and we're in a car and I'm driving. I was supposed to be going to work. I'm not pulling myself together. And he's like, what are you afraid of? What's going on? And I said, how do I raise her for such a bifurcated future? Like some of the people might, want to, treat her like a saint, like sainthood, like, oh, look at you, you're so brave, and the others, in certain places, her chance of being murdered, like certain, like, how do I teach her to navigate such extremes of reaction, because people are so irrational when it comes to gender and expression and these, gender in general. And he just was very calm in that moment and said, I think that the world's hard for all of our children, and we can't control the world. The only thing we can do is make this little nest, this place called home, where she knows she's loved and protected and maybe a little spoiled, because we spoil all of her. But, really loved and protected and taken care of. And this is the place, that's what we can control, and we're going to do the best we can with that. And then my husband did have to come to terms with his own, issues around it. And I think, especially, sometimes he's run on gender lines. Fathers sometimes have struggled, particularly with having trans daughters. But he very early on, told me his issue with it, his fear. He's a D1 college athlete, and he was, he's a coach, and, comes from a very a bunch of different broy cultures. And, he said that, his fear was that people, his friends, would think it reflected on him, that this was his weakness manifest.
Yeah.
And as soon as he said it out loud, it was such a relief just to say it out loud, because I said, wow, your weakness sure is powerful.
Can change the world.
You can alter this child completely. I said, well, it really didn't have, do you really feel like it had much of an impact on the older kids? Like, did you make our sons, did you dial their masculinity and feminine, and our daughter, did you have a hand on that dial? And your father, did he choose how, you're all, we kind of, just let it out there and kind of poked at that idea, because, it's a silly idea, and he got over it very, very quickly, luckily. But a lot of people get stuck on that because they've really so fully imagined a future for their child.
Yeah.
And that's so deeply rooted to what their identity is and who they want to be in the world and how they want to be perceived. And it becomes very hard for them to kind of pull those two things apart. And luckily, my partner went through that and landed on the other side pretty quickly. But it can become such a sticking point, for people, who like have kind of over-identified with that kid and just can't see this is a unique individual put on this earth, and that each child teaches you how to raise them.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting that anecdotally, it does seem that fathers often have a hard time with trans daughters and mothers often have a harder time with trans sons. And I do think that's about expectations or wanting something to carry forward of yourself. And when people do see, like you just said, that kids teach you how they need to be raised and supported, usually that's sort of the tipping point. It's like, oh, right, like my kid is who they are, right? Like they aren't a carbon copy of me, no matter what their gender is. And I think that really, once people can get to that stage, it does really help. But there's often that mourning. Mourning, you talk about the fact that you did not particularly relate to the concept of mourning. And a lot of trans people feel frustrated with the idea of like, oh, you had to mourn me? Like, I'm here. I'm alive. Like, there are lots of trans people who are dead. Like, I know a lot of trans adults who are like, fuck you. Like, I am here and you're having a hard time, to their parents. So I think but I also know enough beautiful, struggling, loving cisgender parents of trans kids who are mourning. There's no other word for it. And it's not because they don't love and support their child. Right. So, I think it's complicated, and I appreciate that you make space for that, reaction, even though that's not your reaction. And I think it's hard. It's hard as a trans adult when people say that, because I think it does feel like an erasure, of like the gift of surviving, I think, for a lot of trans people, when we know so many trans people die prematurely. But I also do get that it can be a stage that parents get stuck in. So one of the things that I really enjoyed was reading about how, your daughter is the youngest of 4 kids, and she has 2 older brothers and an older sister, and that she affected her older brother's sense of masculinity too, right? Like they did become more, it sounds like, more well-rounded, empathetic men because of her, and that your daughter became a more well-rounded, empathetic woman because of her. Like that she had that impact on all 3 of your other kids seemed really powerful and beautiful.
Yeah, and that's why I'm always like, why would you not want a trans kid in your school? That's going to be alongside someone who is truly living an authentic life and has to work really hard to strive for that authenticity, and is living daily, breathing example of somebody living as their true self. Wow, that's empowering and freeing for other kids, to see that journey. So once you start, practicing that compassion, it's easier to, practice compassion with lots of different groups of people. And so, I was incredibly happy that, my kids, were on that journey. And, I think it's also great that she was young. I mean, that honestly, in some ways, maybe that made it somewhat easier because we'd already, gotten over ourselves as parents. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I say, like, parenting is an incredibly humbling act. Like, if you do it right, you should be humbled. You should feel like you're failing, not quite getting it right, and then starting anew. And our older kids, we were clearly, not carbon copies of us. They were individuals, with their own individuality, their own uniqueness, set in motion at like full steam ahead, right? We didn't have as many things like that attached and embedded, like this child, I didn't get it right, but this kid is going to get it right, they're going to right my wrong. So, that was over or short-lived. But definitely I see how it is dehumanizing to mourn a person who's standing in front of you. I mean, I'm not exactly sure how, but Yeah, it's incredible how that would be hard, because there's so much to love in the person standing in front of you. If you just allow your gaze to really be loving, and then you're like, oh my gosh, this is incredible human being in front of me. Different from the ideal that I had created in my mind. But all parents need to have that breakdown for them, no matter whether their kid is trans or not. It's very unhealthy for a parent to be in love with an ideal of a kid instead of kid standing in front of them. And for a kid to feel like they have to right their parents' wrongs, like be great at this sport because their father, didn't win the state tournament, like what a terrible thing, like for a kid to have to, live under, so these are lessons that are good for all parents, to break down these things.
Absolutely. I think I hope that our listeners who have, I certainly think our listeners who have trans kids will get so much out of this and will feel so validated by the way that you write about your family and about your experiences. But I really think that parents of cisgender kids, or kids they assume are cisgender, should absolutely read this book, because it is a beautiful meditation on parenting in general and on what makes a child sort of a child-directed parenting possible, while still being like a boundaried, healthy adult parent, right? It's not, I think sometimes when people hear like child-directed, child rearing or whatever, people imagine some like kid throwing a tantrum and being really entitled. But like, letting your child clearly always had a sense of self and presence. And people often assume that children, one of the sort of boogeyman kind of arguments about trans kids is, well, 3-year-olds play make-believe and think they're astronauts. Why should they be allowed to decide what their gender is? Like, but we know based on research, we know anecdotally, we know based on any of our own experiences, whether we're cis or trans, that we do know what our gender is at 3 years old. We do, that's actually not even controversial. But this idea that, because we play make-believe or we have creativity about things that we can't know ourselves at a young age is so dishonoring of children in general. And I think it often, again, speaks to this patriarchal idea that children are not to be valued across the board, right? Like that children are add-ons or accessories and are really just there to be accomplishments for their parents as opposed to whole people. And I think, so when I hear adults say, well, a child can't know, and that's my fear. My fears are going to change their mind. I'm like, well, they might change their mind. That's also fine, right? Like,
right. Yeah, that was also a fear of mine. And Dave was like, you mean your fear is that we're going to just raise a typical boy? And I was like, oh, yeah, well, it sounds kind of silly when you say it that way. I'm sure. But yeah, it was great to do the research, and I really came at the research, as a person of faith, because I'm just awed by the complexity of, the human brain. And so I got to look at the genetics, the genetic components of being trans, the neurological, the brain, all different kinds of, endocrine system, all different fun things for me to look at. Also got to look at the American Academy of Pediatrics, which you're referencing, which is, says by 3, like I myself understood, I could label myself as a girl at 3. By 4, I was pretty stable in my gender identity, right? And so was my daughter.
Right.
So, that doesn't speak as well. Sometimes that's the majority of people, how they move. This doesn't speak as well to people who are non-binary or who come out later, but it does speak to a lot of people. Those are the typical steps. And my daughter was typical, just not in the gender that we assumed. So all that was wonderful and great. And that's what I don't understand sometimes about Christianity and different. They want, for some reason it to be simple. Like you can glance at a baby at birth and then know forever and ever, this is it, because we just saw some blunt framework and of the body, like done. But, when they go in for cancer treatments, you don't want somebody to be like, sorry, we can't tell if you have cancer or not. We should be able to do that with a quick glance at the body.
Right.
They're completely happy to know that we've made advances in science and medicine that can detect on a cellular level these things. And so, yeah, the idea that I was awed by the research that I got to do, and the gorgeousness of the design, which for me, reflects God's work, and to try to dumb that down, or to try to say, no, it's just two boxes, M or F, to me is to just kind of strip away what this incredibly beautiful work that, has gone into our creation. And I have a line like, it's snubbing God. It's snubbing beautiful art. And I said, in our house, we don't snub God, So, that part was frustrating to me. But again, I also had wonderful support from nuns. There's a great, minister in, he was an evangelical minister in Texas who I adore. He does great sermons on that are LGBTQ inclusive, and he's wonderful. And so, yes, my daughter is banned from all Catholic high schools in our diocese because we ran up against that wall. But we've also had people who really understand, that this is a beautiful design, and we should celebrate everyone because God and nature loves diversity.
If it wasn't so dangerous, I would have sadness for people who couldn't see that, right? I mean, it's like, man, your life is so small, like you're missing so much beauty and complexity, and your life is so fearful and narrow, right? But because it is so dangerous, it's hard to have empathy for those people, because I'm just like, you wield an enormous amount of power, and it's scary, because you can hurt our children, and that's terrifying. But it's, I mean, to me, I think that part about snubbing God is such a good way to put it, because it's like, how arrogant of us to assume that we understand the design, right? Like, that's just wild to me, that people feel like, oh, well, we can know, right? It's like pretty much everything else we know about the natural world and biology has evolved immensely, right? Like, we're learning new things all the time. So it just makes me sad for those people when I can conjure up enough empathy to feel that.
Right. And this is what I think that allies are good for. Like, if somebody does have the bandwidth to reach out to the people, it's so that, trans people don't have to take that on themselves. We need to widen our net of support and allyship, and we need a bigger group of people. And we need to, continue to band together. And I think actually that Roe v. Wade is an interesting, entry point to that too, because it does, again, as you were saying so brilliantly earlier, it really does follow, the same playbook in a lot of ways. So, we have to stick together on all of this.
Well, and we know, and I think you had a statistic in your book, but certainly in my family, and certainly in most Catholic families I know, every Catholic woman that I know uses some form of birth control besides the rhythm method, right? Like, it's not, for all of the bluster about what the church officially sanctions. Of course, I know very strict, observant Catholics who, still are, who don't use birth control. I'll just say it that way.
I know one. That's it. Out of all the Catholics I know, and you have to think of my whole, like, everybody, I know one. That's it.
I mean, so it's like this fundamentalism that I'm like, this does not reflect. And I think part of, I mean, we could have a whole other conversation about abortion, but like, I think that it is possible to, I think there's not enough conversation and visibility about the wide range of emotions and feelings and beliefs about abortion among people who've had abortions, right? Like, there's such a wide range. And so it's like, I do wish, just as a person who was raised Catholic, that that there was just so much more, like, Catholics are a much more diverse population, and yet the dogma and the fundamentalist piece is so narrow. And it's like, you know, this is actually like a really interesting, dynamic, beautiful theology that gets sort of rammed down into this very tiny subset of things that's very essentialist and patriarchal in ways that make it incompatible for me personally, like with real life, you know? And I think that's a shame because, you know, particularly being in Georgia and Charis is right next to two seminaries, we are around so many queer and trans people of faith, right? Who are like, I know that my queerness or my transness is God-given. Like, I know that I was made this way and that it is not a defect. It is an asset. It's, you know, it's not a bug. It is the program itself, basically. And I think we see that more at Charis probably than other similarly leftist spaces because we are in the South. But I wish there were more conversations that really included the visibility of trans people of faith, because there are so many, you know. They just often are not welcomed into organized religious spaces.
Yes. I was really moved by Shannon Kearns, Father Shannon Kearns. And I don't know if that might be a name that people might want to look up, but I get his, and he's a trans man and you know, and a minister. And I love his work, and he's done some really great work on the trans experience and looking at the Bible closely. So Kearns is Kearns. And I think he actually has a book out too, so that he might be somebody to look up. But I did a lot of work there in the book, you know, looking at the Vatican's documents on gender identity, trying to look at them with as much love as I could find, and kind of finding these like footholds, toeholds, you know, to get in there. And I do find that, you know, in that document, there's transphobia, there's a lot of issues, and, you know, homophobia and whatnot. It's a mess in some ways. But there is love in there. You can see there's no way around it. They have to kind of have that compassion and love, and they know that they have to have it, you know? Yeah. And so I feel like I can build on that. How much can I get, and how much can I build on it? How much light can I let in and then work with that person? So I do believe that there, you know, if somebody has a grandparent or something like that, you know, this book, you know, my book might help them, but there's other resources too that can really help speak that language and open a person up. Yeah.
I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about the idea of sort of the broader queer family that you tried to help facilitate or build for your daughter and with your daughter. And then also this question of assimilation, because it comes up a lot. It's sort of an inside conversation, right, among trans people of, you know, older trans people who are like, what's going to happen to these younger kids, particularly kids who have a binary transition, and what will they lose queer community? Like so much is gained by them being supported and protected and having access to appropriate medical care from the time they are very young. And sometimes I see resentment from unhealed trauma in older trans people, but mostly I see people being very happy that young children have the support they deserve and need. And I do see worry or curiosity about what it will mean if trans children effectively grow up in such a way that their experiences from the outside do not appear to be that different from the experiences of cis children. And you wrestle with this a little bit in the book and raise a lot of, I think, useful questions. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, because it creates a class system almost, you know, the haves and the have-nots. Mm-hmm. And certainly we need, it's a small community anyway, and we need everybody on board. And not only, the person who, can, assimilate and move on and distances themselves from the trans community. I think a lot about them being kind of locked in a lonesomeness that eventually wears on them, Mm-hmm. And I think that they, miss and long for that connection. I think Disclosure was such a great documentary. Laverne Cox was the main person who, I think Sam Feder was the actual, I think I've got the right person, director, mm-hmm. producer on that, trans man. But Laverne is one of the main speakers in that. But there's another woman in there who was an actress and didn't come out until, I don't know, her 60s or something like that. And, you can feel the lonesomeness because she would see another trans person and she couldn't reach out and even say, I see you, here, look at us, look what we got here,
Yeah.
And it's just so brutal that she, was divorced from her own community and all the love and support that she would have gotten from that community, but she couldn't risk it, at that time. And I understand her dilemma. I understand her choice. I'm sympathetic to that choice. And ultimately I'm sympathetic with everybody who makes that choice. I don't have to make that choice. I can't judge that choice. But I do think about it for my daughter, and I certainly try to remind her and instill in her. And she's got, we have, family and friends. We have one trans cousin. We have, some people I think of as like godmothers and, in her life who are trans, and trying to, and also trans friends and groups that we get together with that almost feel like trans cousins, that she's known since she was little. And, and really feeding those relationships over time, because there's certain experiences. Again, you were talking right at the beginning of like cis parents raising trans kids. I am, a witness to something that is gorgeous and beautiful and like transformative, but I'm never going to be part of that community. I will never be able to speak to her about the experiences, her lived experience, mm-hmm. In the way that another trans person can. And so it's important to me to build those friendships and to build those mentorship opportunities and, to create that for her. These are your people. And you have two families. You have us, we've got you, right? But you have a huge, enormous, and powerful, LGBTQ plus community that has this beautiful, gorgeous, long history, and you will need them and you will draw on them and you will have to give back to them, it can't be one-sided. So, yeah, so I think about those things an awful lot. In my office space, there's my husband got me a painting of a photograph. It's Sylvia Rivera and Marsha, at the police line. It's a pretty famous picture. I don't know if you know of it. Mm-hmm. Sylvia's got her fist raised and Marsha's under an umbrella. And it's just like such a great photo, and that he, behind my back, got a painting done of it. And that's really awesome. Beautiful colors by James Kane, who's a really great up-and-coming artist. And so... yeah, but that's for her in a lot of ways. I mean, it's for me, to remind me, of the journey I'm on with her, but also like, look, this is who we praise. This is who we raise up. Like, these people came first and they gave a lot for you, they paved this road for you. So when I hear that, the older trans community is, there's a little bit of hurt or like a little resentment there. I'm like, let's heal that,
yeah.
Because one thing that we can do, and what I would love to see more of, is more respect for our elders, LGBTQ elders, and less, like, because a lot of times there's fighting about, you don't know the new language, and you're not, you're set in your ways, and da-da. Yes. Okay. But can we all rally around, the fact that, they were here through AIDS and
yeah.
and the incredible history, and they were here through the civil rights movement for them, and, gay power, and, how do we, I want to heal that. I want the younger generation to turn to those elders and really be able to know that history some and be able to thank them.
Yeah, I think that's so beautiful. And it's all of these things are these sort of generational alliances are complicated, right? It's like that grief for what was not possible in your own childhood, mixed with joy or gratefulness that someone else gets more freedom than you had. I think that is often a hallmark of a lot of different civil rights struggles, right?
Yep.
Like, we fought for freedom. You now have more freedom than I had, and there's pain in that. And I don't think we talk about that enough in movements in general. It's tricky. And, you know, I'm thinking about one of the things that we often kind of joke about in a lot of the trans groups that I facilitate is like what people think transphobia is like trans people getting murdered, which unfortunately, obviously, sometimes it is. But most of what transphobia is the day-to-day barrage of horrible, like, administrative bullshit, right? It's like filing paperwork and being disrespected and, like, fighting to change laws, fighting to change health insurance, fighting to change HR stuff, which you certainly experienced on your daughter's behalf. And even your experiences with the diocese in trying to enroll your daughter in Catholic school. And there is this, what I appreciate is you kind of had a realization that all of your good, I think you refer to it as like good girl, you know, like hard work ethic didn't matter. And I think that is one of the things that can be shocking to trans people, as like, and particularly white trans people, is like, because I think white people, most of us don't experience, you know, a fraction of this kind of administrative, daily, grinding disrespect that people of color experience in this country, unless we have another intersection of oppression, like we are, you know, disabled or, you know, very poor, or, you know, like there are other things that can help us understand this. But I think for trans people, it's like, oh, I am constantly disrespected at every turn, and people just shrug and say, oh yeah, that's too bad. Right? Like, I'm so sorry that's happening, with a smile on their face and an intent to do absolutely nothing. Right. And so, but what I was going to say is that, you have experienced that because you have been advocating for your child and for other people's children. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, as we're kind of closing out, what has that experience taught you? And if you were to impart some advice for parents who also want to be activists for their own children and the children of others, you know, what advice do you have for them as they encounter these hurdles and probably many more discriminatory laws coming down the pike? Like, what do you hope for them, and what would you kind of wish maybe that you knew at the beginning that you know now?
Yeah, wow. How much white privilege did I have going into this? Like, I'm going to be plucky, you know? And they're going to listen because I'm so plucky and determined. And obviously, you know, so, and then meeting other well-intentioned white ladies in bureaucracy, you know, just wasting my time, you know, just talking to me on the phone and, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Well, that is so terrible, blah, blah, blah. And so much of that. And then nothing happening. And me feeling good after the call, like that was the point of the call, was just to calm me down and I feel listened to, so I'll go away. So much of that. And I really learned a lot. Like Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about good intentions in a way that's really great, you know, because like your good intentions, what do they actually achieve? Don't talk to me about good intentions, you know? And I had a friend too, who was kind of like, you know, we would go out and she's a therapist, she's Black, and she would, you know, hear me talk about, like, if somebody has good intentions, I can work with them. We'd have these arguments about good intentions. She's like, go for it. Go try your good intentions out and then come back and let me know how it goes, you know? And she was so right. I got really, really, really burnt out on good intentions and well-meaning people who had no intention to do anything at all. Yes. So, I mean, the thing is, like, in the face of it all, you still have to keep going, and you still do have to. The thing is that what I want to say sometimes to these people who, are in my path, and I can't get the thing that I need for my daughter, whether that is the right to education, the right to health insurance that I pay for, all this stuff. Is that, look, what you have going for you is that you have a 9-to-5 job, and it's your job to do X, Y, and Z. What I have on my side is I will never stop.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a mother, and this is my child, and I will keep going and going and going. So you fight with that. You go ahead, keep going. I will keep going. I have no stop here. I will come back the next day, and I will come back the next day. And I'm not raising my voice. I'm not getting angry. I will keep coming back, And so, and also the power of the American family. It's like raised up, like, oh, this family, the American family, great American family, and because, we are that family, that white family, we are, the heterosexual, cisgender, and so, that they enshrine it in
mm-hmm.
America. And so if that's a tool that you have in your toolbox, use it,
Yes.
Yeah, I will, put on my little suit, my little skirt, and my hat, and my pearly look thing, and I will come at you with that, because you've given it so much power to disenfranchise a lot of other people. But if that's the thing you're going to do, I'm going to come at you with it. So I use all of my tools in my toolbox, even if those are my privilege, right? All those privileges, but if may as well put them to some good use.
Yeah.
And then the fact that I'm just going to keep coming back, and back and back and back. So, yes, and I even have to still believe in good intentions. I do. Like, even though there's part of me that just knows it's not going anywhere, I still have to take the toehold that I get and keep moving forward. So, for example, yes, my daughter was banned from the schools in the diocese, and the superintendent and I, had some really hard conversations. But at the end of that, I worked hard to keep that relationship open in some way. Listen, if he hears about this, he might not be super into it. But, I worked hard to keep that relationship open and not slam the door and not leave in anger, because I know that there are trans kids in those schools right now, and who can't transition. I know that they're going to get in a situation where they're going to need help. They're going to need somebody who knows, how to speak this language and how to, really advocate and help them. I mean, I hope that they would feel like they could turn to me, or at least use me as a resource to get them to other people. So the thing about, when I work with parents and other, adults who get it or don't get it, I'm really just advocating through them. It's always about the kid for me, So I might seem like I'm on the parent side and, cajoling and being sweet and, and working with them where they're at, meeting them where they are and pulling them along gently. But I'm always there for the kid.
Yeah. You got to meet people where they are. And I think that's so powerful. One of the things that we talk a lot about, both the Gender Creative Parenting Collective and in our Anti-Racist Parenting Collective, is like, particularly white womanhood and motherhood has been weaponized so much in the history of America. If that is the tool in your tool belt, use it. There is nothing more powerful in America than a white woman saying, not in my name. You can't use me to further your right-wing fundamentalist agenda, whether that's about racism or homophobia or transphobia or whatever it is, because so much of this Christian fundamentalism is enacted in the name of protecting women and children. And it's like, if you say that is not, you can't do that. You can't do that and say it's for me. I am telling you that's not for me and that's not for my child. That's a really powerful move. And I do think not enough mothers in particular feel that that's a powerful thing. And so I appreciate your framing of that, because it's so powerful. And I think often that persistence and that love is the only thing that's going to change these horrible labyrinthine systems. because it requires privilege to stay on the phone that long, like, I mean, it requires advanced degrees to understand how to parse the language in some of these insurance refusal letters. I mean, I think about that all the time. Like, my God, like I have the access and the education and the time to do this. And I'm going to do this because I can, because I know so many people can't. And this sucks. And, like, it's so important that those of us who have the ability to do it and shout about it over and over and over again until people realize. Because I think, with the quote unquote trans tipping point of Liver and Cox on the cover of Time, it's like people, and particularly with the Republican Party's strategy of trans people are taking over, trans people are everywhere, trans people are, forcing their way into your child's locker room at school, in the bathroom, and all these things. It pretends that trans people have an immense amount of power, when in fact trans people have a lot more cultural visibility and almost no power, right? And so it's this very tricky dissonance between perception and reality. And so even when you're dealing with like neutral or perhaps people with good intentions who are working the phones, they think, well, like, oh, you're fine, right? Like, it'll be okay. And then you're like, oh no, it's not fine. Like, actually, I am being denied the right to education, healthcare, all of these things. And even I have good friends who just, live in other parts of the country who are shocked at what is denied by my health insurance, which is through the state, what is not allowed in the state of Georgia, all those things, right? Like, they are legitimately shocked. They're like, oh my God, I can't believe that. And I'm like, yeah, guess what? Like, that's actually the majority of the country has anti-trans laws, right? Like, that's not some antiquated reality, and it's now actively getting worse, right? So I appreciated you spending as much time as you did talking about how difficult the administrative struggles are, because those, much more than some fictive battle in the streets, like, that is the way that most trans lives play out.
And you have very, very real consequences. I mean, if you can't get an education because you're afraid of being bullied because you're allowed to be bullied by your teacher, then by, incorrect pronouns, then you end up, leaving that school. If your parents don't have the money to private school, then you're denied an education. Once you're denied an education, you're derailed from, all of these, and then you're not getting employment, and then you're not getting good health outcomes. I mean, it spirals so fast. So everything matters. I mean,
2/3 of the children, the teens who are in our teen support groups, do some form of online or homeschooling because they don't feel safe in their schools. And and there is no recourse for them. And people are like, well, can't you form a GSA? Can't you? They're like, there is a GSA. Like, it doesn't matter. And I think that's the piece that's so hard for well-meaning people to understand. They're just like, surely there's a nice teacher there. Surely there's someone. What about the guidance counselor? What about, and the kids will just, look at us and just be like, no, there's nobody. And it's heartbreaking. And it's like, I mean, it makes me want to cry every time, because I'm just like, yeah, I believe you. I actually really do. Like, I don't think you're exaggerating. I believe you that you don't. And so then it's like, we need to make a sort of resource map and safety plan for you. And that safety plan might be like, where are you going to run? And that is a terrible thing to teach a 13 or 14-year-old to do. But that's the reality that we're dealing with some kids. And it is physical violence. And sometimes it's emotional violence, which is just as brutal as physical violence. But this idea that, there's good adults everywhere. There are a lot of well-meaning adults who are not going to put their neck out to help. And that is what's so, I mean, it is like the Dr. King's white moderate, right? It's like, it's that is what is so painful, I think, and so well expressed in your book, is like, it's those people that really break your heart. Because you're just like, oh, okay. I see where my family stands. Okay. And when the scales fall off your eyes, one of the things that I think is really beautiful how you end the book is, you know a lot more about pain and loneliness, but you also know a lot more about joy, and like who are the people who really showed up, and like who are the people that you can really count on, and those people sometimes are really surprising, and the gifts of this experience have been really surprising. So I want folks to know that this is actually a really joyful book. It's a really fast read. It's a really enjoyable read. So even though it's talking about really hard and important things, it's so accessible. Even if folks are not, regular readers, I hope they will pick this book up. It is hot off the presses. It came out on September 13th from Blair, and it's just a beautiful book. So Carolyn, thank you so much for spending all this time talking to me. It is a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thanks for all the work you're doing. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Is there anything, do you want to let folks know where they can find more about the book? I know you have a website. Do you want to shout that out?
Yeah. Carolyn is spelled Carolyn, and Hays is Hays. No E. So that's just .com. And actually I want to put your resources up on my page.
I will email them to you.
We have resources, but we need to put you all up there.
That would be great. Yeah. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for all the work that you do. And I'm so glad to have this book to hand to new parents, or parents who are new to this journey, because I think it's going to be a real comfort to them, even though or certainly a validation of the hard aspects of this, but also, what a rich life you're in for as a parent of a trans child, and what a gift that is. So thank you for highlighting that aspect. It's so important, and I think it's going to make a lot of people feel less alone.